In August of 2018, when my channel was just a few months old, I made a video discussing whether the Pokédex is reliable. For a 3.5-year-old video, it's held up surprisingly well. Camera quality isn't great, but other than that, it's still a pretty good video. If you haven't watched it, I suggest that you do, and you can come back to this one afterward. Here's a very quick recap. Pokédex entries throughout the years and across all regions have been very repetitive in the information they provide. Plus, they are often self-contradictory between different versions, sometimes they are hard to accept at face value, and sometimes they are patently untrue. What I conclude from this and other evidence is that the research behind the Pokédex, research into Pokemon physiology, ecology, and evolution, is not well funded, and as a result, it ends up being kinda shoddy. But Pokemon Legends Arceus gave us a really unique look into the research process behind the Pokédex, so I wanted to revisit this topic and see what insights we can glean from the Hisuian Pokédex. Let's start by talking about the logistics of the process. This game tells us very specifically how the Pokédex is being created. The Galaxy team employs the Survey Corps to research Pokemon. The Corps is led by Commander Silene and Professor Laventon. Silene seems to be the more managerial person, making decisions about what the Corps should focus on, whereas Laventon is the worldly subject matter expert who has studied Pokemon around the world. Survey Corps members like Ray or Akari and the player character and even Laventon himself go out into the wilds of Hisui to observe Pokemon, take notes, catch Pokemon, and amass data. This data is then handed over to Professor Laventon, who analyzes and compiles all of it, and when he has enough information, he writes a short piece of descriptive text. And Survey Corps members are actually paid for their work. You get paid for catching Pokemon, and how much you get paid scales with your level of experience represented by your star rank. I do find it a little strange that you're paid for catching only and not for completing the research tasks that you're given. I feel like that would be more relevant to accomplishing your goals, but I guess catching is a good enough proxy. Unfortunately, the Survey Corps is the smallest core of the Galaxy team. Before the player character arrives, its only members are Silene, Laventon, and Ray or Akari. That's 4 people, including the player. The Medical Corps has 6 known members, Supply and Agriculture have 8 each, Construction has 9, and the Security Corps has 20 known members. If you think of the Corps as roughly equivalent to Science, Health, Trade, Agriculture, Industry, and Defense, yeah, that distribution checks out. Of course the Army is the biggest one. But that means that the Survey Corps lacks the manpower to accomplish much, and a lot of the workload ends up falling on the shoulders of the player. Once I had completed the Pokédex, I sat down to read every entry. Given how small the Survey Corps is, it's actually impressive how good the end product is. This is supposed to be the oldest Pokédex in terms of the timeline, but it is by far the most trustworthy Pokédex I have ever read. Let me explain why. The most important thing is that this Pokédex is written by Laventon. Not that Laventon has some kind of expertise or reputation that puts him above all other professors. No. But every other Pokédex is written from nobody's perspective. They pretend to be objective, universal knowledge. Laventon writes from his own perspective, using first person and even including personal anecdotes, like in the Pokédex entry for Dusclops. There are rumors that peeking inside its bandage-wrapped body will cause one to get pulled in through the gaps between the bandages, never to return. I've been too scared to verify. That's charming. The Hisuian Pokédex is a lot more personal. It's full of personality, which makes it a lot more enjoyable to read through than any previous Pokédex. Or later Pokédex? But on the question of trustworthiness, what this does is it implicitly acknowledges the bias of the writer. A lot of nonfiction writing purports to be objective, but that's impossible. Everyone has their perspective. Everyone has their biases, even if they're not aware of them. When a writer makes their perspective explicit, it removes this sheen of objectivity. You're not just getting facts, you are getting facts filtered through a person, and people are fallible. I cannot overstate how important and valuable that is. What's more, Laventon goes beyond that. It's not just the occasional anecdote. He includes his speculation and labels it as such, like in the Pokédex entry for Gyarados. I suspect this Pokemon to be the true identity of a dragon written of in ancient texts, which claimed that it raised an entire village with white-hot beams from its maw. It's the same thing when the source of the information is rumors or legends. The entry for Luxray makes this clear. They form packs, each having one male as leader. Legends say that when Luxray's 2 eyes shimmer with gold, the Pokemon can see through anything. There's the factual part about Luxray basically forming prides, and then there's the uncertain part about its X-ray vision. Laventon also acknowledges where research is lacking, like when he says that Ralts tends to prefer people with a chipper disposition to those who are gloomy, but it has shown no discrimination with regard to age or gender. Needs more research. He points out and reasons through his subjective decisions, like when he comments that though it differs from other Basculin in several respects, including demeanor, this one is gentle, I have categorized it as a regional form given the vast array of shared qualities. This shows that building a Pokédex and identifying relationships between different Pokemon is not a straightforward task. I also have to point out, and this doesn't have to do with how Laventon writes, but it's also important, this Pokédex lists Pokemon heights and weights as ranges based on what the player has actually caught and presumably measured. We used to only get one number. This is a huge improvement. All of this gives a lot more credence to the information. We know what is observably, verifiably true, and what is just speculated or theorized. But this also makes it more jarring when the information is incorrect. Reading the Pokédex, a lot of entries stood out to me as unbelievable, unlikely, or even untrue. Compared to the number of entries that seemed solid, there were relatively few bad ones, but some of them were very bad. Here are a few examples to illustrate the different ways that they can be wrong. Laventon writes that Rhyhorn is ludicrously strong. When it butts heads with a mountain, it is the mountain that shatters. A mountain does not have a head to butt with. So to me, it's pretty clear that Laventon is just being a little bit flowery with his description. A few Pokédex entries include some exaggerations, especially ones that have figures in them, like the claim that Machamp can overwhelm its foes with more than 1,000 blows from its fists. I guess throwing an extra 0 or 2 in there for good measure is an age-old tradition among Pokemon professors. Just like treating legends as fact, as in the entry for Zorua. A once departed soul returned to life in Hisui, derives power from resentment, which rises as energy atop its head and takes on the forms of foes. In this way, Zorua vents lingering malice. We used to get this kind of entry all the time. I can only imagine that this is a legend, but unlike most other legends, this one is not framed as such. Zoroark and a few other new Hisuian Pokemon have the same problem. Some flowery language, some exaggeration, referencing a legend. None of that makes the entry wrong necessarily, but if you don't identify these for what they are, you leave room for them to be misinterpreted as fact. We do also have some factually incorrect Pokédex entries, though. There's the common misconception mentioned in several dex entries that Crobat's hind limbs have become another set of wings. But Crobat still has feet. They're small and probably can't be used for much beyond hanging from a tree branch or something, but they're there. I guess you could interpret that it adapted its existing feet into wings and then grew new feet, but that doesn't seem likely. Another common misconception is about Vaporeon. Tests show that its cells closely resemble water molecules, which perhaps explains its ability to conceal its form while submerged. This has been around since Pokemon Yellow, but I don't think there's any way this could be true. First of all, how can the structure of a cell made up of 100 trillion atoms or so closely resemble a water molecule that is made up of 3 atoms? And second of all, Laventon is writing this in a paper Pokédex. He doesn't have very advanced technology. He doesn't even seem to have a standard microscope in his office to see the structure of a cell. He certainly can't compare it to a molecule. But the most egregious Pokédex entry is Togetic. No records exist of Togetic being seen in the wilds. Rumors abound that it evolves under the loving care of a trusted human companion upon whom the Pokemon then bestows great joy. No records exist? This is blatantly false. I'm spitting as how false it is.
Gross.
Togetic appear regularly in 3 different places, and not only that, one of the research tasks is to catch one in the air, meaning it has to be wild. Laventon knows that you can catch a wild one and yet still claims that there are no records? I find it perfectly understandable that this Pokédex is flawed. Not only does he only have 2 assistants working under him, meaning that the data is inevitably going to be limited, but Professor Laventon is the only expert around to filter and analyze all of our data and put together the Pokédex. There is nobody who can peer review our data or his conclusions. So, as I said at the start, it is impressive how good this Pokédex is. But this is also the earliest Pokédex we know of. There may be others that came before, but even if that's the case, this Pokédex predates any others that we've seen before. Which, considering how often the researchers use existing Pokédexes to build their own, this could very well be the original source for a lot of information that's taken for granted later on. Laventon is explicitly the one who coins the term Scalchop for Oshawott razor shell, and Aura for Lucario's mysterious power. But it goes beyond that. Though Gabite are usually of a violent disposition, when I gave one a glass bead it had been eyeing covetously, it suddenly became quite docile. This is another personal anecdote, but it may well be the source of the idea that Gabite love shiny things, referenced factually in the Platinum Pokédex and others. The Heart Gold and Soul Silver Pokédex claims that Chingling emits high-frequency cries that people can't hear. Again, Laventon might be the source. This Pokemon gave me an excruciating headache when it seemingly cried out without making a sound. Perhaps there are some sounds that the human ear is simply incapable of hearing. What this means is that as one of, if not the foundational Pokédex, errors here can get perpetuated uncritically. The misconceptions about Crobat and Vaporeon might have started here. Even the idea that Luxray has X-ray vision might have been originally spread by Laventon. He does clearly state that it is a legend, but it's not hard for that part to get left out. So, is the Hisuian Pokédex reliable? Well, more reliable than the usual Pokédex? For sure. Laventon's approach to writing it by itself is a huge bonus. But it still suffers a lot from insufficient manpower, which goes back to the conclusion from my old video that Pokemon research, or surveying, is critically underfunded. Thank you for watching. If you just started following my channel because you saw me on True Green 7's video, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. If things go according to plan, the coming months on this channel are gonna be top-notch. This video was brought to you by the Libros who support this channel financially through Patreon or YouTube channel memberships, especially luxury patron Ethan from Chicago. They made it possible for me to not edit this video myself. If you want to pitch in and join the community of Libros on Discord, you can click the join button below or check out the perks I offer at patreon.com/UmbreonLibris. I'll see you in the next chapter. Hey, since Raicha's Dex entry mentions that there are Copperajah in Laventon's homeland, but we know that Copperajah are not natively Galarian, you think Laventon might be Indian?